Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vali Nasser, the Dean of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, and it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to today's event. For 70 years, SAIS has been a platform for policymakers and students to engage on critical global issues, and today's event is another one in that tradition, and it's our pleasure to welcome our guest today, Jesper Kohl, to this event. So from the devastation after World War II to the booming economic development in the following decades, Japan has achieved impressive results that have far outstripped expectations. As the world's third largest economy, Japan has been a long-time global economic power as well as a Western ally, and its technological and economic triumphs will continue to shape the global economy in the coming years. Our today's speaker, Jesper Kohl, is one of Japan's most influential strategists, economic strategists, and economists. He has been researching and investing in Japan since becoming a resident in 1986, and his decades of expertise have earned him a seat on several corporate and government advisory councils. In October 2016, Tokyo Governor Yuriko Koike, is that correct? Koike appointed him to her advisory council for the revitalization of Tokyo as a financial center, which demonstrates the high value Japanese policymakers place on his expertise and competence. He's prolific in disseminating his economic strategic thinking as an author of 3 books in Japanese and a commentator on Japanese and international news programs. He's known for his bullish outlook on Japan and its equity market. I'm not setting you up. And believes Japan's future is beaming with possibilities. After graduating from Johns Hopkins SAIS, he started his career as an aide to a Japanese member of parliament before moving into the financial sector. So I highlight that because it's an important lesson for our students, and we're very proud that Jesper got his education and his interest in Japan while at SAIS. He worked at the JP Morgan Japan and the Tiger Fund before becoming the chief economist for Merrill Lynch Japan from 1999 to 2008, and returned to JP Morgan in 2009 as the managing director for equity research. In 2015, Jesper founded Wisdom Tree Investments in Japan. Today's conversation would focus on Japan's unprecedented economic development and the global impact of its economy. And we're fortunate to have an opportunity to hear from Jesper and to learn from his long experience and be able to be privy to his insights on the direction of the Japanese economy. So thank you for joining us today, and please join me in welcoming him to the podium.
Oh, Dean, thank you very, very much. That was a most embarrassing introduction. So I'm just Jesper, and thank you very much for having me here. I think we've got about 45 minutes or so I'll talk, and then we'll have a dialogue, right? So I thought I'd start out, we can get this to work, the story of my life, since I actually did go to SAIS. And you can see there, SAIS sends me to Japan, and everything collapses, right? In fact, Dean, I had this wonderful scholarship. I got $1,000 transferred into my account, at Kyoto University. And at 260 yen per dollar, I was the king of Kyoto. It was awesome, right? But then, of course, we had the Plaza Accord. The dollar depreciated, and I became very poor. And then again, with the help of SAIS, I said, I need a job. And, with the help of some of the professors, I ended up, working as an aide to a Japanese member of parliament. And so I stuck around there for 3 years and then worked there. But you see, story of my life, it goes down there. Story of my life, my economics professor never told me that bond yields could go negative. I mean, this was not supposed to happen. And yet, obviously in Japan it actually happened. Story of my life, I mean, real estate, right? Once I start to earn a paycheck, right, I joined finance in 1989. And of course, 6 months later, everything starts to come crashing down, right? And it's quite interesting. I don't know whether you're aware, if you buy an apartment in Tokyo, right, on what's the equivalent of the Upper East Side, the value of that apartment today is where it was in 1984. Now imagine, can you imagine New York real estate prices falling to a level last seen a generation ago? I mean, you would have a revolution, right? But despite that, Japan society was very, very resilient. The unemployment rate never really went above 6%, right? We are seeing now, actually, for the first time in about one generation, we're starting to see a little bit of a pickup in real estate prices and transactions. And we talk a little bit about that. Stock market, I've done a little bit better, right? And then, of course, should have stayed in America, right? I mean, I work in finance. My God, America just keeps going up. Real estate is basically the same story. So thank God my wife is American. So we've got a little bit of a hedge, in there. You can see that, equities. Well, anyway, we don't need to look at the numbers. Now, I want to talk a little bit about Japan. And, I basically want to leave you with a story, with an idea, trying to nudge you a little bit, that, in this global age of turmoil, right, that actually Japan is a great model for the way a society, the way an economy can actually be managed, right? And, let's look at a couple of things. If you look at the overall genesis, and I'm sure you've looked at this before, this is this famous elephant chart, right? And you see that household incomes, right? Not GDP, but household incomes in the world over the last 15 years or so, or 20 years, have grown by about 25%. That's the blue chart. That's nice, right? But then, of course, if I take away China, you actually see that the growth was only 11%. And what's much more disconcerting, and in my opinion, a lot of the reasons for all this disgruntlement, this is by income group. So that's the bottom 5%, and that's the top 5%, right? You actually see that people from the 50th percentile all the way up to basically the 90th percentile actually saw their incomes decline. That's this loss of the middle class. And as a result of that, in Western democracies, when the middle class, doesn't get wealthy, doesn't get, the dream, right? You vote people out of office. So you've got Brexit, you've got Mr. Trump, et cetera, right? Economic goals. It's quite interesting, right? I mean, Mr. Lipsky, what do you think, Professor? I mean, it's not just, my judge is the stock market goes up and that tells me everything's fine. I mean, we're a bit more sophisticated than that, right? You're not just optimizing, right, for the stock market to go up. You're not just optimizing for economic growth. You've got freedom. You have freedom from government intervention and unfair competition. I mean, talk to the tech guys, right? I mean, is Google unfair competition or not? Anyway, to be discussed, right? Equity, that you've got a fair distribution. Efficiency, yes. Security. I mean, trust me, the older I get, the more I hate disruption. Now, you guys are still young, so please disrupt. That's your job, right? But as a business person, as an investor, I do want, predictability. I don't really want, a lot of volatility there. And then, of course, yes, you do want economic growth, right? So we're actually in a very interesting phase in the global economy because it's been 2 generations basically since the last Great War, right? So you actually have a scorecard. Has the system delivered? And this looks at net of liabilities, net financial assets of the household sector, right? And you see that actually Japan has done quite well, right? Average wealth, despite the fact that real estate prices today are where they were in 1984, right? Despite the fact that the stock market, which used to be at 40,000, now is only at around 23,000. Despite all of that, the absolute amount of wealth, at about 100,000 net of liabilities, right, is actually quite good. You also see that the distribution, of course, there are poor people, assets less than 10,000, yes, 9% of the population, right? But still, obviously the US stands out, right? 1 in 3 people has less than $10,000, right, to their name, right? By the way, it's interesting, the miracle economy is Australia. It's because Australia has a forced saving system, the superannuation scheme. So as a result of that, the wealth distribution, right, and the overall increase in wealth is actually quite good. But the point here being that Japan has actually done a very, very good job, despite the fact that Japan lost more financial assets during the collapse of the bubble economy than she lost during the Pacific War, which is quite an interesting statistics, right, to actually keep in mind, right? When people talk about Japan, they always talk, oh my God, there's deflation. Well, look, is inflation good? People forget about 1/3 of all prices are basically regulated prices, right? And of course, healthcare is a very big one. Now, in the US, healthcare prices go up, basically they double every 8 years. John, does your income double every 8 years? It's quite interesting, right? Japan is ruthless. The government exercises its power. It's not afraid to go against big business interests. They've cut healthcare prices, pharmaceutical prices, as well as provider prices, right, for the last 8 consecutive years. I'll give you another example. 6 weeks ago, Prime Minister Abe calls into his office the CEOs of the 4 big telecommunication companies. And he says, good morning, thank you for coming, and they reveal a chart. It's a bar chart that shows that the average mobile phone contract in Tokyo is more expensive than in Shanghai, Hong Kong, London, New York. The average cost is about 40% higher. He looks them in the eye and says, you will now cut prices by 40%. Thank you. I'm not recommending you buy Japanese telecommunication stocks. But it's interesting, right? You get the point, right? This is a government that actually works to raise the purchasing power of the people. And as you know, Japan has an aging society, so keeping healthcare costs low is actually very much so in the interest of the people. Our future, youth unemployment in Japan is very, very low. Right? Again, the US kind of stands out, right? Angela Merkel has got to watch it, right? Because youth unemployment in Germany is actually on the rise right now, right? Family values, I love this. This is data which is interesting of people who've got households who've got kids in their teens, right? So between 10 years old and 20 years old, basically before you go to college, right? Where do people actually spend their money on, right? And again, unfortunately, the US is rather shocking because half of your money goes to the place that you live in and to get to and from the place where you live to where you work. That's actually, now the point being, investing in your future, supplemental education, in Asia, 15%, in Japan, still a very high 10%. And this is despite the fact that the public education system in Japan is actually very, very good. Now, maybe the American public education, Dean, what do you think? Anyway, you get the point, right? What about growth? Everybody wants to grow? Well, actually, yes, Japan is not the fastest grower. This looks at GDP per capita. And of course, China has been the superstar here. Korea, 4.8%. The US also, pretty good, right? My home country, Germany, yes, very good, right? Japan, not quite so strong, but still a very respectable 2.9% on average. This is not bad at all, right? What about the income distribution? It's very interesting, and this you're familiar with. This is the Gini coefficient, the top 10 versus the bottom 10 of income that people actually earn. And Japan is actually one of the very few countries where the Gini coefficient over the last 5 years has dropped. Why has it dropped? because the bottom 10% have actually gone up. This is very, very interesting, right? Prime Minister Abe, whatever you think about this, right? Half of the increase in the bottom 10% is womenomics. It is the fact that female participation in the labor force is now increasing. 6, 7 years ago, it was a taboo to talk about female empowerment. Now, it is even in the echelons of Mitsubishi Corporation and the Mizuho Bank, you can actually meaningfully talk about empowering women. And that's being reflected in the fact, that the average is starting to actually go through. Story of my life. Sorry, this is a little bit of finance, right? The yellow line is the actual earnings, EPS, earnings per share of Japanese companies, which are now growing. They're at a historic high. And the red line is the valuations, the price earnings multiple. And Japan used to be sky high. Japan was always a Japan premium. Now, it's just not there. So I'm working very hard. I'm actually earning money for investors, but I don't get any recognition. Well, talk a little bit about reality in Japan, right? Now, this is the most important thing. I've been stuck in Tokyo for the last 30 years, and I love being in Tokyo. You know why? Japan is the only place in the world where everybody else is getting older faster than I do. It is spectacular. Now, that's obviously statistically not possible, right? But what is quite interesting, right, is that, yes, Japan is very old. 1 in 4 people in Japan is over the age of 65. By 2025, it's going to be 1 in 3. Okay, this has some implications. How many of you have been to Japan? Excellent. So when you come from Hong Kong, from Shanghai, from Taipei, and you arrive at Narita or at Haneda, you will notice something. You will notice that the speed of the electric walkways or the escalators is about 30% slower than it is in Shanghai, in Taipei, or in Hong Kong. And actually, 5 years ago, there was a government, there was a government public decree to cut the speed of all public walkways, of all electric, escalators, right? And this is correct policy, because when you get old, 1 in 4 is over the age of 65. When you get old, these things become dangerous machines. Now, of course, in America, you don't have that problem, because at JFK, nothing works anyways, right? But again, I just want to, look, this is kind of an analogy for GDP, right? I'm old, I'm not going to run as fast. But the point I'm trying to make here, for you guys who are interested in public policy, the government manages for its people. And its people are old, therefore, there are certain things that you need to do. And for all intents and purposes, I think that that's actually correct. Now, talk a little bit about the demographics. It's the most important message I want you to take away. Japan's demography is actually a tailwind. It is not a headwind, right? People always say, Jesper, you're crazy. How dare you be bullish on a country where in 311 years, only 19 people are going to be left, right? How can you be? It's like, look, what does population have to do with it? What are you interested in? You're not interested in the population. You're interested in the purchasing power. You're interested in incomes, right? And incomes in Japan are now on a structural uptrend. What matters? You're in a demographic sweet spot. Now, for 30 seconds. 1995 was the big pivot in Japan. In January, we had the Kobe earthquake. In March, we had the sarin gas attacks, internal terrorism, right? In June, we had the Jusen crisis, so we had a banking crisis, right? This was, oh my God, the country is sinking. Radical policy changes were enacted by then Prime Minister Hashimoto. Most importantly, he killed lifetime employment. We got the reform in the labor market where you were allowed in all industries, which was forbidden before, you were allowed to hire people on a part or contract basis rather than just hiring on a full-time basis. And lo and behold, that's exactly what Japanese companies did, right? You see that basically since 1995, the only net jobs that were created were part-time employees, right? Today, about 40% of all people who get a paycheck are part or contract. So the salaryman lifetime employment is dead, was killed. Now, why are we in a demographic sweet spot? Because of the shortage of labor. 6 years ago, I gave a TED talk, and the first line was, I want to be reborn as a 23-year-old Japanese. No, because the number of university graduates is declining every year by 33,000 people. Trust me, I want to be 23-year-old Japanese. This year, university graduates, within 10 days of looking for a job, 98% of them got a full-time job offer. I don't know what it is in the US. But you get the point, right? And what is interesting now, because of the shortage of labor, right, which is just demographics, right, what you have is you've got leading companies. You've got Toyota, you've got Hitachi, you've got fast retailing, rehiring people who used to be part-time or contract onto a full-time basis, right? And as a result of that, you have, for the first time in 30 years, this is cool, for the first time in one generation, I've got full-time employment that actually is rising. I believe Japan will be the only advanced economy where we will see the rise of a new middle class. Now, and this is important. If I get rehired from part-time or contract onto a full-time basis, what is the difference? What's the difference? Anybody here? It's interesting, Kathy. This wasn't prompted, right? No, but it's interesting. When I ask the question to the audience, it's always like benefits. And that's true. Benefits, healthcare, pension goes up by on average 15% of your annual income. But much more important, Japanese companies pay a bonus, right? It's paid in the summer, it's paid in the winter, on average about 1/3 of your annual income. If I'm a part-time employee, I don't get the bonus. The moment I get rehired on a full-time basis, I do get access to the bonus. So actually, my annual income goes up by almost 50%, right? Second difference. Japanese banks are nasty. If I'm a part-time or contract employee, love or money does not buy me credit. You can barely get a credit card. You cannot get consumer installment credit, and it is impossible to get a mortgage. So the moment I get rehired on a full-time basis, my income goes up, but I've got access to leverage. This is very, very interesting, right? And in fact, to verify my thesis, I looked very carefully at the mortgage credit data, because if I'm correct, and there's a new cohort in Japan, people in their 20s and 30s, who for the first time in their life have access to credit, they are actually levering up. And it's quite interesting that the credit data, of course there's some cycles and jiggles, but basically it supports this thesis quite nicely. A final point, by the way. What's the third difference? So the first one is money, more money. The second one is access to leverage. Japanese people are smart. If I'm a part-time or contract worker, I can get a date, but I can never get married. The moment I become a full-time employee, my probability of getting married within 9 months goes up to 90%, right? Check it out. There's a listed company called Zwei, as in 1, 2, 3, right? A listed company, that's what they do for a living. They've got all the data. It is very, very nice, right? It is only for men and for women. You'll see in a second, right, what is going on. So we've got engaged human capital, right, participation rates, right? And again, the big increase in participation rates, right, is driven by females, right? The female participation rate in Japan is now 2.5 points higher than it is in the United States. By the way, overall participation here is about, on the OECD data, is 77%. Switzerland is at 82. I see no reason for why the Japanese won't be working as hard as the Swiss. That means 3.5 million people can be arbitraged back into the Japanese workforce. And you see the virtuous cycle. This is fertility rates, right? Better incomes, better contracts, you got lifetime employment, right? Access to credit, and yes, slowly but surely. Now, you're still far below the 2-point-some that you need, to actually be sustained, but still a virtuous cycle is actually kicking in Japan. And as a result, you have the most important thing. You've got an increase in the purchasing power of the people, right? You see that nominal workers' compensation, which was in decline, right, over the last 20 years, that's the reason for Japan's deflationary environment. This is now going up. And it's not going up because of strong exports to China, strong exports to America. This is not a cyclical phenomenon. This is a structural phenomenon. Data point, starting salaries for university graduates this year up 6.1% for listed companies. This is very, very interesting. And again, I do want to be reborn as a 23-year-old Japanese. Now John's going to get angry. My home, my Japan. See, it's the greatest country on earth. Historically, Japan's ruling elite is the only elite that consciously crushed a bubble economy. Okay, we had this big bubble, right? On December 17th, 1989, the Bank of Japan got a new governor, Mr. Mieno. His speech, John, you may remember, the opening speech at the Imperial Hotel, right? He's a very short man, right? He stands and bows and says, "Thank you very much for appointing me to this important position." Second sentence, "Bad things are happening in our country. A graduate from the best university working for the best company can no longer dream of ever being able to afford living within a 2-hour commute from his workplace. This is bad for society, this is a bubble, and I will burst it." And within 6 months, they increased interest rates from 3% to 8%, and of course everything came crashing down. It felt terrible. This is, during the 1990s, the baby boom generation, which basically bought their homes around here, had negative equity. But they didn't get fired, and the banks never foreclosed on them. They paid back the debt. Those debts are now paid off. My favorite statistics in Japan, 48%. 48% of all Japanese over the age of 20 have no debt, but own the home they live in. Japan's household is unbelievably asset rich. 1/3 of all Japanese have a maison secondaire. What is that called? A besso. Huh? Second home, right. Second home, right? Anyway, you get the point here. So yes, we're still growing, right? And this is the population, but this is what matters. Employment is going up. As a result, the purchasing power of the people is actually going up, and this is structural, independent of what happens to the world economy. Immigration is super. Japanese politicians are very smart because immigration is a divisive issue. I don't have to tell you this in America, right? Japanese politicians don't talk about immigration. They talk about labor. They talk about human capital, which is a very, very smart move. Immigration is happening. I mean, look at the data, right? Tokyo. Tokyo is 1/3 of the Japanese economy, give or take, right? Tokyo, according to the census, you had 5 years ago, 3.1% of the people who got a paycheck, of the people who were employed, 5 years ago, 3.1% were non-Japanese. Today, 6.4%. The fastest growing sectors in Japan, convenience stores, right? 1 in 3 people hired is a non-Japanese. When I arrived in Japan, it would have taken 10 years to be able to apply for permanent residency or for a green card, right? 10 years of not falling foul on the law. Do you know what it is today? It is 3 years. Right now, we're still dealing with Japanese. The Japanese are very meticulous. 3 years of not falling foul on the law. So if I got a parking ticket during my 3 years, I'm back in the queue. Now, maybe that's good immigration policy. Sorry, right? But it's quite interesting, right? That you've got the reality, right, of pragmatic use, right, is actually increasing. Another fun fact, Kyoto University and Tokyo University, so now I have to be politically correct, the Harvard and Stanford of Japan, right, it was undergraduates, right? At Kyoto University and Tokyo University of the graduate school, 42% of the students are Chinese. Which is very interesting. That tells you the Chinese are very smart. It costs $8,000 a year to go to Tokyo University. It's a perfectly fine, not as good as SAIS for international relations, but it's a perfectly fine school for engineering and things like that, right? So it's quite interesting, you know, the exchange that is going on. There's twice as many flights between Tokyo and China per day as there is between the United States and any other country in the world, right? Which is quite interesting. So you've got obviously this inbound boom, right? Which also changed the landscape in Japan. It's quite interesting to talk about Prime Minister Abe. He became the Prime Minister on the 26th of December 2012. His first act in power, he seconded a heavily armed Coast Guard frigate to the Philippines so that the Philippines could defend their rocks, right? The second act in power was to liberalize the visas for the People's Republic of China. You basically, as an individual, you couldn't come to Japan, now you can, and as a result of that, you know, you do have this massive inbound boom that actually is going on here. And I actually think that this act of Prime Minister Abe, Philippines, which is, you know, basically looking at the People's Republic of China and the potential threat that you've got there, building allies in the rest of Asia, but at the same time being very, very pragmatic about actually fostering integration. I'm going to rush a little bit over this. This is, you know, what I do for a living, which is you actually have to talk about companies, right? Because at the end of the day, we can talk about the economy all day long, but as an investor, you invest not in the country, you invest in companies. And the problem with Japanese companies was what? That they were incestuous insiders, right? And this, you see, cross-shareholdings. The equity, I mean, who owns corporate Japan? And you had, you know, basically 30 years ago, you had half of the equity tied up in the keiretsu, right? So if you were not part of Mitsubishi, if you were not part of Sumitomo, if you were not part of Mitsui, you had no access to proper accounting, you had no access to corporate strategy, you were literally in an us versus them world. And this was caused, you know, mathematically or empirically, you know, you look at the cross shareholdings, you know, to sort of show this. This has come down dramatically. And in fact, as we speak, the cross shareholdings are still unwinding, so that probably by the time of the Tokyo Olympics, the cross shareholdings are going to be close to nil. What does that mean? It means that Japan is open for business. Toyota is now sourcing steel from POSCO, the Korean company. This would have been unthinkable, right, under the keiretsu system with the cross shareholdings. Another example is, what was last year's big corporate story in Japan? Toshiba, right? Toshiba, oh my God. Now, Toshiba is one of the oldest members of the Mitsui family, right? In the old days, when your family member gets into trouble, you circle the wagon. 8 years ago, when Olympus got into trouble, the Sumitomo Group circled the wagons, right? Toshiba, now, the Mitsui Group said, we don't care. We're not interested. And the result is that now 72% of Toshiba is owned by the devil, by foreigners. Which is kind of, again, I just want to give this as an example, right, in terms of what's going on. There's a lot of inward investment into Japan by the People's Republic of China. All the industrial conglomerates, right, Panasonic, Sharp, the major buyers have actually been Chinese corporations. And it's actually going very, very well in terms of the integration that's going on. But the key message here is that Japan is open for business, right? The old cross-shareholding structure basically has made that so. Corporate Japan is beginning to be focused on returns, right? And I'm going to rush a little bit here. But what is interesting, John, I've got no superstars. Sorry, it's a little bit, this is wrong. This is the other way, right? This is the distribution of the return on equity for listed companies, right? And you see, you know, Japan is this nice bell curve, right? Very few superstars. Now in America, it's very interesting, right? You've got a fair number of companies who are actual superstars, right? So, you know, Japan is much, much more modest, right? We only have Softbank. Sorry, that was a joke. In terms of the, you know, are Japanese companies with the changes in cross-shareholdings, with the introduction of the stewardship code, with the introduction of the corporate governance code, are they more focused on shareholder returns? The answer is yes, but there's a long way to go. This is the payout ratio. So if I make money, how much goes into share buybacks and how much goes into dividends? In Japan, it's now 21%. 10 years ago, it was 15%. So thank you, you've gone up, but you're still much, much below the rest of the world, right? Which, of course, I use as my marketing thing. That's you should be investing in Japan because they can only be improving, right? My favorite chart. Dean, this is the failure of capitalism. No, look, this is awesome. This is what you need to talk about, right? This is listed companies. How much cash do you have on your balance sheet? And I've divided it into GDP so that you can compare it across the world. I mean, it's meaningless to say Apple has $450 billion on the balance sheet. It's like, what does that mean, right? But, you know, you can see the blue line 10 years ago and now. Of course, Japan is the world champion, right? This has gone up to over 130% of GDP. I showed this chart a year ago to Prime Minister Abe, and he was frothing at the mouth. He said, oh, let's tax them. We could double GDP. By the way, it's funny. It's not funny. Taiwan has introduced legislation that if you have cash on your balance sheet and you don't use it, right, you actually will start to be taxed on this. And it's a big policy issue that you've got. But, you know, why is it that it's not just Japan, the failure of capitalism? It is in France, oh my God, right? China, UK, Korea, US, Brazil. Everywhere cash balances are going up. Why is that? You're a listed company. You're supposed to be greedy and maximize returns. And cash holdings go up while the return on cash goes to zero. I mean, to be discussed in your seminar. Sorry, I have to do one pitch for my home country. I mean, as you know, Germany, it was easy. We could always talk about football, soccer, and it was clear that Germany was the best. It's not, no, terrible, right? Not good. But Germany is the only country where the cash balances have gone down. Why is that? Because Germany is the only country that actually does have a different model of corporate governance. And there's all this high-minded talk about corporate governance, right? But when the chips are down, Germany has a different model because the labor unions sit on the board. So if John and I run a company and we make a profit and we've finished paying ourselves, we still have got something left over, and we don't want to invest, or we don't think we need to invest, we don't think we want to buy another company, we don't think we need to raise the dividend, right? Then the hands go up and says, yep, and therefore it goes into wages. So it's quite interesting, right? You know, in just to putting things a little bit into perspective here. So we've got a domestic demand story with this new middle class that is rising. Good. We've got a corporate sector that is starting to focus on returns, right? does Japan actually have the intellectual property, the basis to be competitive? And look, I mean, this is tricky, right? I mean, how do I analyze, how strong you're going to be in the future, right? Now, one way to do this is to look at research and development spending. This is OECD data, and Japan is one of the highest in the world. And interestingly, in Japan, 87% of the R&D is done by the private sector. So you and I can actually buy into the intellectual property base that you've got, right? In America, about half of the R&D is actually done by the government sector. So it's very difficult to actually purchase into that directly, right? Now, I've got all this IP, but I'm a disaster at selling it. I mean, my favorite company, Tesla, does not exist without Panasonic, right? All the battery stuff, it's all Panasonic. And I ask you, which box, right? This is a home battery. Which one would you rather have in your genkan, in your hallway, right? So again, Elon is a genius, right, at actually marketing here. Japan is not very good. I mean, look at this, right? Toyota versus Tesla. Have you looked at this? This is profits. I mean, Toyota actually makes money. Toyota makes serious money, very serious money. Elon has yet to make money, right? That's the share price. Welcome to America, right? It's absolutely great. Now, Toyota has just tied up with Softbank, right, to develop an autonomous driving vehicle. So it's, the competition is going to intensify. Fun fact, how many cars does Tesla make per week? 2,500, right? How many cars does Toyota make every 11 seconds? 2,500, right? Sorry, switching around a little bit. What do you think? Future of work. It's great, right? And this is like cool. This is like, my God, let's talk about the future of work. John, 40% of our jobs are going to be done by robots and artificial intelligence. And if that's the case, trust me, you want a declining population. Sorry, that's food for thought. Reality check. How many of you have been to Japan? Almost everybody. You know her? She's my second favorite woman in Japan, after my wife. Right? This is, on the Japanese train system, right? On the Shinkansen, right? The bullet train, every 20 minutes, psh, the door opens. And I'm sorry, it's always a woman. She bows, right? She pushes her cart through the thing. She wears a uniform, by the way, that changes 4 times a year with the season, right? She takes part in the company outing in the summer and in the winter. She's a fully integrated part of the system, right? So she comes through the thing, she smiles, and you stop her and say, hey, yeah, I would like a can of Coke. Okay. And, with a smile, she gives you the can of Coke, or everything, omotenashi. And then comes the good part, because you say, how much? And she says, 150 yen, which is exactly the same price as it is in a vending machine in Tokyo. That is not possible from an economic perspective, right? Now, what is interesting is that this woman, she works for a subsidiary of Japan Rail. That subsidiary is not in business to make money or maximize return. That company, that subsidiary, is only in business to provide a service, right? As a result of that, the return for Japan Rail is depressed. I'm from Germany. We've got similarly good trains, right? In Germany, if you're lucky, and it's always a guy, there's a guy pulling the trolley, right? And he wears headphones listening to hip hop. And you say, I would like a Coke. And he goes, what the hell do you want, right? Anyway, it's 4 times the price of what it is at a vending machine. Because Deutsche Bahn every year puts this out to bid, and whoever's the lowest bid is who gets the job, and as a result, they have to charge higher prices. Why do I make this point? You're familiar with this. This is Mr. Piketty, right? Our neo-Marxist from France. Sorry. But, look, empirical, this seems to hold rather well, right? The return on capital is larger than the return on labor. So the question is, how do I redistribute from a policy perspective. Now, I can tax capital, but oh my God, that's terrible, right? But if you do it, if you have a redistribution like we have with the subsidiaries, right, it actually works quite well. So note, I'm very bullish on Japan, but do not invest in Japanese pharmaceutical companies, do not invest in Japanese telecommunications companies, and do not invest in Japanese rail companies, right? Everything else is fine. We're going to skip to this. This, by the way, is well, let's do this. So do we have time? How are we doing on time? Okay, so let me introduce you to be a little anecdotal, right? So I'm very lucky. I've got this office right in front of Tokyo Station, right? Like literally right in front of Tokyo Station, right? The Shinmaru building, right? It's a multi-use building, so there's 7 floors of retail and restaurants and bars, right? And like all new buildings in Japan, right? You've got this information desk there, right? And there's these 2 ladies who sit there, right? They are again employed by a subsidiary of Mitsubishi Real Estate, right? So I've played this game with my customers, right? I said, look, do a little experiment. Go walk up to them and ask them, excuse me, where is Tokyo Station, right? And they bow, and they take out their iPad, they fire up Google Maps, and they point out that Tokyo Station is right there. Now, if you do the same thing in New York, first of all, there's nobody like that, right? And then if you do find somebody, right, maybe a security guard or something, and you ask him, where's Grand Central, at a building that's right in front of Grand Central, he said, just right over there, you idiot. Anyway, but, you know, the point being that Japan can raise productivity tremendously. So this one is not very nice. But this one I was able to invite for a glass of wine, right? To figure out how this works, right? So it's quite interesting, right? They have a test every 3 months. Anything inside the building, they must know by heart. So if you ask, I want to buy red shoes, right? At a store conveniently located to a toilet where I can change my baby's diaper, they will know instantly where it is. But by rule, anything outside the building, they have to fire up Google Maps. Why do I use this example? Well, because productivity, right, is an issue in the overall system. And in the overall system, productivity, you know, is in manufacturing, Japan is perfectly fine, right? I mean, there's business cycles that happen. Sometimes you've got a good car, sometimes you've got a bad car, you know, but basically on any international comparison in the tradable goods sector, Japan is perfectly fine. It's the domestic, the services sector, right, that is lagging very much behind. And I believe that, you know, what is going to happen now is that actually, you know, the reason for why the service sector is so unproductive is, one, because of the internal rules that people adhere to. The second, more important one, is the fact that the service sector has not invested, right? This looks at capital, you know, intensity. You see that, you know, the blue line, the manufacturing sector, has continued to invest in the latest robots and the latest technology. The service sector has not. And the idea is that you've got now, finally, Japanese service companies, whether it's financial corporations, whether it's logistics corporations, you know, actually beginning to invest more aggressively, right, into fixed capital, right? So we shall see. It's quite interesting, right? Because you talk about Japan, and, you know, from an American perspective, you always assume that everything is like America. Well, it is not, right? In manufacturing, in wholesale retail, and in construction, Japan is bigger than the United States, right? The US is bigger than Japan in the public sector, which is very interesting. Japan is not big government. Japan is strong government, but it's not big government, right? Professional services, you know, omotenashi, right? It's very difficult to get paid for anything there. And then in finance, of course, you know, you've got this, this issue there as well. The reason I brought this up here, you know, on the government sector, what do they say, John, at the IMF? Never waste a good crisis. Japan is the only country that didn't waste its financial crisis, right? You had massive systemic regulatory reform and bureaucratic administrative reform, right? Japan, after the financial crisis in 1995, ripped out of the most powerful ministry on earth, the Ministry of Finance, the Banking and Securities Supervision, set up the FSA. And I dare you, talk to the people at Goldman Sachs, at JP Morgan, at Morgan Stanley. We all think that Japan's regulator is now the best regulator in the world. In the US, after the financial crisis, there were some rules. The Volcker rule, more stringent capital constraints were imposed on the banks, but there's no regulatory change. When I was at JP Morgan, we were joking with Jamie Dimon, every single day at JP Morgan, there's at least 51 different regulators in the building. And trust me, at JP Morgan, we love it. We can play one against the other. For us, at JP Morgan, to hire another lawyer is not an issue. In Japan, a unified financial regulator. Government reform, you see that you actually went, the number of ministries went from 22 to 13, which is very, very interesting, right? There's some growing pain. And again, size versus strengths, there's no correlation. Japan has strong government, right? But it doesn't have big government. What do you think? Got to talk about China, right? It's right next door. All these flights, all those students, right? Okay. Number one, despite all this wonderful stuff that is happening in the domestic economy, the listed companies have actually become more dependent on the rest of the world. US companies, about 50% of your earnings come from overseas. In Japan, it's 64%. And as you can see, it has actually grown, right? And the reason it has grown is that the Japanese banks have very successfully expanded overseas over the last 4 or 5 years. Japanese banks have been now for 3 consecutive years the single largest lender, the single largest supplier of credit to non-China Asia. It's very interesting, right? Where does the money come, where do the profits come from, right? This is today, this was 10 years ago, right? And it's obviously exports or offshore production, right? And you see that the US basically used to be 1/3, now it's 25%. Still the single most important block, and I include what used to be, what is that called now? NAFTA. I can't pronounce this. The what? US and NAFTA. The Mexico and Canada, right now it's 25%, but you see that obviously the importance of the People's Republic of China and of the rest of Asia, has obviously increased, right? What do you think? You afraid of China? Sorry, that's a lot of numbers, right? This is a competitive matrix, right? So you look at the UNCTAD trade database and you say made in Japan versus made in China, what percentage of goods actually competes head to head? And basically 10 years ago, only 28% of made in Japan competed with made in China. I mean, China was making sneakers and t-shirts, Japan was doing robots and chips, right? Now it's 65%, right? I mean, China builds the bullet train. It's perfectly fine. Whether they stole the technology from Japan or not is irrelevant. The Germans think they stole it from Germany, by the way, right? It's all irrelevant, right? The point is very competitive. John, how can I get from 65% to 90%? One industry. What does China produce at home but does not sell or produce in the world? You familiar with this? On your next, to customers, Dean, on your next boring conference call, Google it. Do you know this company? Trumpchi. Trumpchi is a brand like Lexus is to Toyota of the Guangzhou, state-owned enterprise, right? No, it is China at its very best. So Trumpchi, for those of you who are Chinese, you know this, Trumpchi has been the best-selling car in the People's Republic of China for the last 3 years. Prime Minister Abe went to play golf, right, at Largo del Mar with Mr. Trump, right? 3 days afterwards, the the CEO of Trumpchi was in the White House because he wants to be the first Chinese to produce or sell cars in the United States. Is this 3 years away? Is this 5 years away? I mean, who the hell knows, right? But clearly, the competition is going to continue to be increasing. What about Abe? What do we think about Mr. Abe? It's interesting, right? 33 years in Japan, there have been only 2 prime ministers that were in power for more than 12 months, right? Koizumi and Mr. Abe, right? After 12 months, basically, these people were lame ducks or were pushed out. Very unpredictable. Now, this is one of the most stable governments that we've got, right? Certainly amongst the G7 countries here. Interesting. Couple of things, sorry, for economics, right? Fiscal policy used to be stop, go, stop, go, stop, go, right? Boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust, right? Whether you like Abe or not, now it's consistent. It's a small net plus to the overall system. They're just now compiling another supplementary budget. It's not huge, but it's going to keep a small tailwind in the national economy. Money policy is very interesting, right? The Bank of Japan was never able to get to negative real interest rates. Now we do have negative real interest rates. So again, that's a very positive backdrop from the policy framework. Prime Minister Abe, whatever you think of him, these people are unbelievably coordinated and very, very pragmatic. There's no ideology. They have a problem, which is very interesting, right? Remember, incomes are rising, quality of job is going up, everything is going fine. But Mrs. Watanabe is earning money for the first time in 30 years, but she's not spending. During Abenomics, you see that compensation, so incomes, basically rose by about 24 trillion, but consumption is up by only 14 trillion yen. So ironically, the system from a macroeconomic perspective is back to where we were. Japan is the largest creditor country on earth, the largest saver on earth, right? And the consumer side is not there. Why is that? Well, it's interesting, right? Economists would say, what is it called? I forget it now. What is that trap called? Ricardian Equivalence, right? Oh my God, there's all this government debt, right? The people are not stupid. At some point, taxes are going to go up, right? But it's actually much more tangible, right? I love economics, but I also like to be practical, right? Kathy, my wife, and I, of our friends in Japan who are not poor, right? Every single one of them has problems getting their parents or their grandparents properly looked after into old age. And remember, Japan is socialized medicine, socialized old age care. It's basically an obligation of the state or an assumed obligation of the state that they would take care of you. And that system is starting to crumble. And as a result of that, precautionary balances, are actually going up. Very, very difficult to solve this. We can talk about this in the discussion. One other thing that's interesting is close to my heart here that, household assets. I mean, Watanabe is earning more income, she's not spending, so she's saving more, which is great. But how is she saving? In exactly the same way as she did before. It's still deposit, deposit, deposit. There's no risk-taking that is actually going on. Why is that? You mentioned in your kind introduction that I'm a member of this committee to revitalize Tokyo as a financial center. And obviously, my God, if only we could get a little bit more shift in the portfolio towards riskier assets, then the financial services industry would be doing much better, right? And so in my talk, in my first introduction there, I pointed out that, well, maybe Watanabe is actually very smart. You know what the average cost of the average financial product sold in Japan last year was? 430 basis points, 4.3%. In America, it's now down to about 1.2% or something like that. It's quite interesting, and it's very interesting. It's actually not the asset management fee that is very, very high. It is actually the distribution fee, right? There's a lot of kickbacks. There's a lot of very weird stuff, that actually is going on, right? My favorite chart. I mean, look, I'm German. We're supposed to be holy, untouchable independence of central banks, as Mr. Powell is finding out in America, right? Look at this. I mean, we've got this largest experiment in financial socialism, that we've seen. Normally you see this in war economies, right? Here you've got the Bank of Japan, I'm going to buy 80, and you, at the Ministry of Finance, you're issuing 40. What's more is Japan is the only central bank that actually intervenes in the equity market, right? And this is the single biggest pushback I get in the real world, whether it's a sovereign wealth fund, whether it's a hedge fund. Foreign investors are, and by the way, domestic investors as well, are not prepared to commit to the Japanese equity market because one day the central bank governor will have to stand in front of a microphone and is going to have to say we're going to stop buying or, God forbid, we're going to have to start selling. And they already own basically 8% of the equity market. It's a very interesting exercise, right? And nobody has a clear answer, right, on how to get out. Final point. Where does growth come from? I'm sorry, it's funny, right? Because you have all these clever people talking about all this complicated stuff, and where does economic growth actually come from? It doesn't come from interest rates going up or down. It doesn't come from fiscal policy. I mean, that creates some business cycle, right? But empirically, the only consistent source of growth is entrepreneurship. And this is, long data, right? This is GDP per capita, and this looks at the share of entrepreneurs in multiple economies, right? Who is that? Who is that? No. China is not in there. China doesn't count because China is still a resource mobilizer, right? But this is Israel. This is Israel. I mean, think about it, right? I mean, sorry, I make a flippant remark now, right? But you've got the ocean in front of you, you've got the desert behind you, and everybody else wants to kill you, right? So you better be smart, right? Now, Japan, as you can see, I mean, it's interesting. America is actually doing quite well. And every business person, every investor I speak to, Trump, whether you like him or not, the deregulation agenda, fostering entrepreneurship, at the regional level, at the small and medium-sized company level, is a hugely positive deal that you should not underestimate, right? Japan is chuto-hampa, right? Is neither here nor there, right? I've got one big criticism for Prime Minister Abe, right? I think they're doing a great job, but Japan has a lot of rules and regulation, has strong government, right? That can be an impediment for you and I setting up a company, right? I can give you a concrete example. I run a company, we've got 9 people on our payroll. If I hire one more person, I will also have to hire somebody who runs an HR department. This is Japanese rules. This is stupid. I want to grow my business. I want to hire. I'm not going to hire because I basically need to hire one deadweight, right? Sorry, HR, very important, but deadweight if you're an entrepreneur, right? So it's quite interesting. Now, of course, the real point of this chart is what? Is the fact that France is so much worse than Germany. Yes, very important. Always got to keep this. It's interesting, right? Who creates jobs in Japan? Remember, we talked about full-time job creation. This is by company age. And again, it's young companies. It's entrepreneurs. I mean, Mitsubishi doesn't create... Oh, sorry, anybody here from Mitsubishi? Very good company, right? But they don't create net jobs, right? Interesting, right? People ask me sometimes, what's different, right? Where did Abe come from? What happened in 2012? What? That was 2011. You're good, you're in there. So we had the setup, right? We had a natural disaster that you don't wish on anybody with like incompetent management for 1,000 different reasons, right? But then what did you have in 2012? These are my islands, right? You had the whole Senkaku conflict, right? And people forget, the United States of America, Japan's largest ally and security provider, every 10 years or so, every 5 years or so, they do this, strategic review of the US-Japan alliance. And this was led by Joseph Nye, right? And I mean, you can read this for yourself. It was no longer clear to the Americans that Japan wants to be a top-tier nation, right? So from Japan's elite's perspective, you've had the challenge to national sovereignty from the People's Republic of China, and at the same time, you had the United States very openly saying, look, do you have what it takes? Do you want to be a top-tier nation? So Abe got elected. Nobody I mean, it's interesting. The really important stuff, nobody tells you it's going to happen, right? Nobody predicted that Abe was going to make a comeback. Why did he make a comeback? Because of his very, very strong, patriotism, nationalism, right? And, a very strong team to actually pull things together, right? So this was the motivation, right, that actually happened there. And Abe is very, very interesting, right? It's brutal power politics. This is not about consensus, right? They have no problems firing, the chief editor of the Asahi newspaper, right? There's no taboos. This is very interesting. I've operated in the Japanese public sphere for 30 years. There were issues you could not discuss. You could not seriously talk about women. I mentioned this. But you could not seriously talk about defense. You could not talk about the emperor. Which is very interesting. There's no taboo, right, in the current system here, right? Anyway, you get the point. Japan is ambitious. They've got a virtuous cycle that is going on in the domestic system. They've got a lot of intellectual property and companies, that are open for business. So from that perspective, I think it's quite interesting. Dean, a challenge to your Japan program. You're familiar with this, right? Japan is the only, OECD country that still has currency that actually floats on water, right? So for the students, in your next boring class, get out a little piece of water, put a 1 yen coin, get it to float, take a picture, and he or she who has the nicest, the best picture, next time I come here, I will give a bottle of sake. Thank you very much.
So we have some time for questions, and Jesper, you want to just field them yourself?
No, please, just go ahead. Ladies first. Yes, right. Yes. Yep. Right.
Women are really not, women are not professionals, so she wants to do some analysis based on the TV programs where the women are not represented. She was talking about the doctors. I was wondering.
Right.
Like actually Korean female medical doctors is not very high, but compared to Japan, it's better. So I'm wondering about your opinion about the women, that part. The second, you're talking about the immigration. Yeah, I've read Economist article a couple of months ago that the actual Japanese started to have more immigrants. So there are many senior homes have the migrant workers, but sort of like they sneakily. No, government didn't say that kind of thing, but now Japanese seniors think, oh, it's not too bad. They're pretty good. They're from Indonesia, Bengal, whatever. They're pretty good. On the other hand, I must say that Japan has a deal in terms of refugee issues, I guess, so that if my memory is correct, Japan took only 32 refugees.
90.
Like 2 years ago or something. That's the most recent statistics. So I guess that they got a deal that they will pay more money, so they have less. But I'm still quite curious about it, particularly because I'm working on integration, migration issues in America, actually Europe, particularly in Germany and in Korea. So I'd like to have your
So I think,
opinion
to your first point, right, you're absolutely correct in terms of, the genesis of Japan, right, being, very actually openly discriminatory, right, against women. There's no question about this, right? The question is, what is the rate of change? Has there been an inflection point? And certainly at the corporate level, right, the inflection point has been reached, right? And you're actually beginning to see, not just increases in participation, but also empowerment in the sense of more directorships, right, being awarded to Japanese females. It's still very low. For listed companies, it's about 12% of all companies have got, a female executive director. 5 years ago, that was less than 5%, right? And there is an implicit target, right, not explicit, right, to get that to 30% by 2030, right? So, the movement there, and in other areas, other professions, like the medical scandal, right, the change in the landscape, right, the fact that the scandal at Tokyo University was actually unearthed, was actually investigated, right, I think, again, sets a very, very good example, right? So you've got a long way to go, no question, right, against a very long history, right? But the trajectory is definitely on the positive side, right? On the immigration side, right, it's very interesting. Like I mentioned, immigration as in immigration is, I'm not going to use the word taboo, but it's still, you as a politician, you will not really talk about this, right? And about nanmin, about refugees, right? This is very much on my terms, right? So very, very, the minimum I can get away with, because, there is a fear in one way, form, shape, or another, right? But again, if you look at the empirical data, right, in terms of is there more foreign participation in the workforce? The answer is yes. Now, you mentioned nurses, which is interesting to me, because I got into a big fight, right? They're always like, oh my God, only 2% of the Filipinas or 2% of the girls, of the women from Indonesia who take the nursing test pass the test. Okay, that's actually not interesting. You know what's interesting? Only 46% of the Japanese women who take the test pass the test. It's a stupid test. And the reason is that the Japanese Nursing Association and the Doctors Association don't have a gradation system. In the US or in Europe, if you become a nurse, or in China, you start out as, a night nurse, right? And then you sort of work your way up and you pass different tests to get different qualifications as you move through the systems. In Japan, the test that you have to take is at the highest level. So you have to basically become a nurse, for brain surgeon, right? Even though you're just going to be a night nurse, right? Abe wanted to change that, but the Nursing Association and the Doctors Association basically lobbied very, very hard to make that impossible. It's one of the big reasons for why this kaigo, right, for why this care system, is also blocked. The barriers to entry, because of the guilts that Japan has, are actually being kept very high. Sir.
Hello, my name is Evan Sankey. I'm actually a product of the Japan program here.
Good.
I'd just like to say you gave an excellent presentation. I think it's one of the best presentations I've seen about Japan at SAIS. I would like to play devil's advocate a little bit here. I would not want to be a 23-year-old Japanese.
Okay.
Okay, and let me explain why. You skated over the tax issue and the public debt issue a little bit. You mentioned them, but if I'm a 23-year-old Japanese, given the old age dependency ratio, given the debt problems, given the geopolitical challenge from China, I can basically expect that, especially given the fact that the Japanese government has low tax rates right now, my tax burden is going to go way, way up over my lifetime.
Right.
The second point I want to make is you asked the question at the end, where does economic growth come from?
Yeah.
And you said the economic growth comes from entrepreneurs.
Right.
I would put it differently.
Uh-huh.
Economic growth comes from young people.
Okay.
And Japan doesn't have that many of those.
Right.
And if I'm a 23-year-old and I want to be an entrepreneur and start a business, I need other young people to be an entrepreneur with.
Right.
And that's going to be hard to find, especially outside of Tokyo.
Right. right?
Anyway, thanks
No,
for your talk.
I mean, look, I mean, first of all, the point about the taxes is very, very fair, right? And I mean, this is just data, right, on tax collection. It's quite interesting. Japan, again, taxes capital, right, higher than the US, and that's before these recent tax cuts in the corporate tax, right? And actually at the individual level, right, Japan's tax take is relatively low, right? And so increases in the consumption tax, et cetera, are very likely to be coming through. And Japan has a very progressive tax system, right? The base for when taxes kick in is relatively high, right? You don't pay taxes until you earn, right, the equivalent, if you live in Tokyo, right, until you earn about $30,000 per year, right? So, but then it becomes very, very progressive, and Prime Minister Abe did raise, the top income tax rate from 45% to 55%, right? So, you're sure, but even my hedge fund friends, right, will say, look, taxes, you only get taxed on what you make. So you make money, you're fine, right? I mean, how much do you need to live? And, the one thing I would say for Japan, the public services that are provided with the taxes that I pay are excellent, right? So it's quite interesting, right, from that perspective. I mean, you can go on and on. We can argue about the fiscal deficit until we're blue, right? From my perspective, I don't think it matters, right? The young generation, right? Yes, that's true, right? Now, the older I get, the more I'm in favor of old people, obviously, right? And there's plenty of entrepreneurship amongst old people, right, that can happen there. But your point about the clustering, right? The fact that outside of Tokyo, outside of Osaka, Kyoto, right, of the Kansai area, right, it's very tough. And the fact that you've got enormous amount of land flight, right? That is, the disparity between the two major urban areas, right? Kansai, Tokyo, Kyoto, Osaka, Kyoto, and Tokyo, right? And the rest of the country, that is growing and growing and growing. And there are very large frictions, right, from that perspective. But inside Japan entrepreneurship, they just changed last year angel investor taxation. It used to be that if you're an angel investor in your startup, right, and your startup goes pear-shaped, which is what happens, right? I could not offset the loss against my other financial assets, right? Now I can. So actually there's, if you want to become a venture capitalist in Tokyo, right, it's a phenomenal time to actually do that, right? Any other? In the back, please. Who are you?
Third-year dual degree student here in the
third-year what?
Third-year dual degree student.
Dual degree, okay.
And actually interviewed your wife for a paper I did a couple years ago, which was cool.
You interviewed my wife?
Yeah.
Good.
And so question that I have is kind of going back to entrepreneurship a little bit. Fair points about all the regulations and difficulties there. But I think for a lot of younger Japanese people, being an entrepreneur isn't really seen as cool. I think last numbers I saw were like 7% consider it to be a good career choice. And Masayoshi Son wasn't taken seriously, he said, until he got on the cover of Forbes. And so how do you kind of deal with entrenched attitudes about wanting to get your Seishain status and just chill out and, not having a group of young people really wanting to start companies?
So it's very interesting, right? I'm not sure what the data is in the United States, right? I mean, it's probably a little bit higher, right? Maybe 12% or something like that, right? But I doubt that it's 25%, right? But let's not, so what's the culture? The culture of risk-taking, right? The biggest problem with entrepreneurship in Japan is that you've got a culture where you're not allowed to screw up. That's the single most important. Mr. Yanai, right, who's the richest man in Japan, fast retailing, he set up 29 companies and they all went bust before he found the gold mine, right, with fast retailing. So he's a fighter. Mr. Son is a fighter, right? There are other people who are a fighter. There's a guy, who just bought for $100 million a Basquiat and he's going to fly around the moon, right? He's Japanese. So again, horses for courses, right? It's interesting, right? How do you foster this? How do you foster this, right? Now, let me just give you an interesting anecdote. I think it's very interesting, right? So, Dean, we've got a committee by a Tokyo governor who's very ambitious, right, and not afraid to make enemies, right? And she says, fine, we want to revitalize Tokyo as a financial center, right? Great. Who do you think is the sponsor or are the sponsors for the committee? You would have thought this is about revitalizing Tokyo as a financial center. Let's compete with Shanghai, let's compete with Hong Kong, let's compete with Singapore, right? So you would have thought that you've got Mitsubishi Bank, that you've got the securities companies, that you've got maybe the insurance companies. You would have thought this is a committee to revitalize finance, that it would be financial companies. No. You know who the sponsor is? Heiwa Real Estate. It's a real estate company that owns a bunch of real estate around the Tokyo Stock Exchange. And so I go, wow, these guys have got guts. They're hustlers, right? The financial guys, salaryman, protecting, right, my current fiefdom. So it's quite interesting. That's the same mentality that applies entrepreneurship, right? The same risk-taking culture or fear of taking risk in the large corporate conglomerates, right, is also there. And I believe, as an economist, right, one big reason for that is the way Japanese companies pay people, right? Technically speaking, now almost 90% of listed companies have pay for performance. Professor Yoshikawa, who is the head of economics at Tokyo University, right, did the study on the actual numbers. And if you look at the bottom quintile versus the top quintile, you know what the average gap is? 15%. Trust me, that's not the way it works at JP Morgan, right? So it's quite interesting. There's a pro forma. So if you're just on a seniority-based system, right, how does this work? How do I get incentivized to actually take risk, right? So that's an issue, just broadening out, right, from, from the entrepreneurship stake, right? And it's very interesting in this whole hataraki kata kaikaku, right? So the labor reform that is going on in Japan, right? We were heavily arguing for government incentives to introduce pay for performance. The Keidanren, the Big Business Association, is dead against this, which is very interesting. Please.
Hi, Grant from EJF Capital. I'm from a hedge fund here. So other than you talk about capital market do worry about the balance sheet problem of the BOJ, another thing I want to say is the credibility problem of the BOJ. So BOJ has reputation always behind the curve. They always get late into the reaction point. And now a lot of people blame Kuroda. You have the net interest rate, negative interest rate, and you let all the banks afraid of taking risk, right? And you depress all the ROEs. Do you think the BOJ will screw up things again this time? On the other hand, Kuroda is the first governor we see ever for BOJ who choose to coordinate with the government. And what if Kuroda stepped down after retirement? We have an old BOJ mode back on, and everything you said will just screw up by BOJ again like 10 years ago. Thank you.
So, okay, it's very interesting because, I think, was it you or somebody else taught me, in my day job, right? When your forecasts go wrong, blame the central bank. And of course now when the forecasts go wrong, we blame Donald Trump, right? But, sorry. Look, the reality is that you've got, remember 3 arrows, right? You know what the 3 arrows are about? 3 arrows are not something that you shoot. 3 arrows are about 1 arrow I can break, 2 arrows I can break, 3 arrows I cannot break. The coordination of policy that you've got, right, is rock solid. And I personally think that, yes, you can worry about the future and who the hell knows, right, what is going to happen in the future. But for all intents and purposes, right, the coordination between the Ministry of Finance and the Bank of Japan, right, is absolutely rock solid. And I think that post-Arbit, this will continue to be the case precisely because, you know, you do have this massive debt burden, and the only way to fix it is by actually nationalizing it, which is exactly what the Bank of Japan is doing, right? So I'm not that fussed about it. As a German, do I think that that's cool policy? No, right? But do it the other way around. I was at the Treasury this morning, right? Is Japan's central bank manipulating, you know, financial asset markets? The answer is absolutely. It is totally manipulating asset markets. But is this manipulation of the domestic asset markets leading to international distortions? The answer is no. Because the yen, you know, over the last 6 years, the yen has gone up and down. There's cycles in the yen, right? And you can show empirically the dollar variable, right? Whatever determines the dollar is a much, much stronger factor in terms of international capital flows, right, than what goes on in Japan, right? So you're a small country, right? You know, you're not a big country. So from that perspective, you know, it's not a big concern, right? Sir.
So at the end of our time, it's still fascinating, counterintuitive at many levels. So thank you very much for joining me, and thank you, Jesper.